The game we know as Half-Life almost didn't happen. According to senior Valve designer Ken Birdwell in a 1999 post on Game Developer, nay Gamasutra, it was originally supposed to ship in November of 1997. But in September of 1997, with just a handful of months to go, the game was looking bad. Per Birdwell, quote, "Yes, we had some cool monsters, but if you didn't fight them exactly the way we had planned, they did really stupid things. We had some cool levels, but they didn't really fit together well. We had some cool technology, but for the most part it only showed up in one or two spots. So you couldn't play the game all the way through, none of the levels tied together well, and there were serious technical problems with most of the game. There were some really wonderful individual pieces, but as a whole the game just wasn't working." But Valve was in a somewhat enviable position. Privately held and financed by its founders, millionaire ex-Microsoft employees Gabe Newell and Mike Harrington, they were able to decide to simply rework the project instead of shipping a mediocre title.
Okay, I'll secure this area.
This is, it should be pointed out, much easier to do in an era where game budgets were typically below $10 million. To do the rework, they first made a prototype level combining all of the best aspects of the game they had in front of them, which convinced them that what they had could work, it just needed to be concentrated down to the good bits. Refined. And to get there, Valve established what Birdwell would call the Cabal. The Cabal were a cross-disciplinary group that included senior engineers, level designers, artists, and writers from across the project, who would meet 4 times a week for 6 hours a day to discuss specific areas of the game and how to improve them, with the result being action items that could be taken to each department to improve that section of the game. Valve's Michael Abrash, speaking to Jeff Cayley in the final hours of Half-Life, described it this way: "For the most part, level designers can't design games. What Valve figured out was that you needed a creative committee to design a game. A level designer worries about things such as how to lay down the bricks, but not necessarily the story and the scope of the game." And broadly speaking, at least for the time, Abrash was right. It would vary from studio to studio, but most first-person shooter games at the time didn't really have anyone at the helm of the whole project, so to speak. Need I remind you that Tom Hall was creative director on Doom, id ignored all of his ideas, then they fired him because they didn't like those ideas, and Doom 2 and Quake simply didn't have a creative director. Which you can tell when Doom 2 was just more Doom, and Quake was a confused and thematic mess even if it had an impeccably specific tone. Its art and sound design were clearly directed, but a cohesive project it is not. Now, that's an extreme example, but it kinda shows what was happening. You might have a design bible or meetings discussing the overall project once a week with the whole team, but at the time, level designers went off and did levels, programmers engineered cool technology, character artists made neat-looking little guys with cool animations to put in the game as enemies. It's not that nobody talked or that there wasn't a plan, but there really wasn't anyone singularly responsible for directing everyone's efforts towards one vision. And Birdwell acknowledges this was happening at Valve. Quote, "Until the Cabal process got underway, technology was added to Half-Life freely. It was assumed that if we build it, they will come, meaning that any new technology would naturally find a creative use by the content creation folks." It did not, and Birdwell cites the beam technology as one example of something engineers made that found almost no use in the game because the artists couldn't figure out what its utility was. The idea of the Cabal feels analogous to Pixar's Brain Trust, which also came about as a means to solve similar problems of cross-departmental communication.
But each one of you in your companies, you have different rhythms, different groups of people. And the important thing is, say, okay, I'm going to start off with something, and we're going to keep improving it. Why does it work? Why doesn't it work? What do we have to do to make it work? And you just figure this out. That's the management job, is developing your own brain trust culture, which is one based upon the trust and honesty. And it isn't like every meeting's like this, they're not, but you have some like this because they're critical to the product of what you're making in your company.
And criticisms of this approach are not uncommon. There are the accusations that Pixar's Brain Trust is largely an old boys club, especially under John Lasseter, among other allegations. Henry Selick blames the Pixar Brain Trust for ruining his film The Shadow King by making constant change requests and ballooning the budget until the project was cancelled. And Valve famously envisioned themselves as a workplace with no hierarchy. People Make Games did an incredible piece on that idea that I'd recommend checking out. But how does that idea of a flat structure gel with the Cabal, a group of thought leaders that go to every department and tell them what they'll be fixing and how? It's very Animal Farm, We're all equal, but some members of the Cabal are more equal, you know? So don't take this video as an endorsement of this development methodology. But I do think the Brain Trust, the Cabal, whatever you want to call it, and however problematic it might be, is why Half-Life is the way it is. They provided a holistic view of the game that tried to ensure every department's work supported the work of the others, and they kept an eye on the overall minute-to-minute experience of playing that defines the whole game. There's an attempt to constantly keep players engaged, to not just let the game's core loop be what carries you through some levels and then you call it a day, but to ensure that each part of the game offers new systems, new locations, or new ideas, and this can only be done if all departments are contributing to those new ideas and someone is making sure they're doled out regularly. The most obvious way you feel this playing the game now is in its pacing. Half-Life's levels are all pretty small and they're all interconnected, so the game isn't really broken out by a series of individual level files like most other games at the time, even though it has them as a matter of technical necessity. Instead, it's broken out into chapters, sections of the game that each explore an idea or a mechanic or a setting. For example, the game's opening chapter, Black Mesa Inbound, is mostly a train tour of the Black Mesa Research Facility that establishes the tone of its 1950s super science laboratory with ties to the military-industrial complex, all while doling out the credits, in alphabetical order without roles because Valve has no hierarchies, and delivering some brief exposition about the protagonist, Gordon Freeman. The chapter We've Got Hostiles introduces the plot point that the human Marines might not be there to save you after all.
Rescued at last! Thank God you're here!
And spends much of its time testing your ability to avoid laser tripwires and turret traps. Blast Pit is about getting fuel and power to a test rocket to take out a giant tentacled monster that you need to sneak past. Each chapter has something different on offer. The core combat is just sort of the glue that holds it all together. You're always shooting alien monsters or evil government soldiers, but you're doing that while you activate a missile into low Earth orbit, or trick a giant alien into the path of a generator you're about to turn on, or cross the treacherous desert where soldiers of both human and alien varieties have gone to war. And sometimes the ideas that Valve had to mix up the gameplay or story couldn't support an entire chapter onto themselves, so they become little mini-set pieces or vignettes within a themed level. For example, an encounter with the Ichthyosaur to get the bolt gun and escape the water research lab. Or the snipers you encounter in Surface Tension.
Somebody, please help me. I'm dying out here. Please, help me.
They're one-note things that you finish in a few minutes and basically never encounter again, but they're memorable and break up not just the game as a whole, but the individual chapter you're in. Half-Life's illusion of vitality is not that stuff is always happening on a systems level, but that you're never very far from running into something new, something interesting, something exciting. Again, quoting Birdwell, "Our goal was that, once active, the player never had to wait too long before the next stimulus, be it a monster, special effect, plot point, action sequence, and so on. Since we couldn't really bring all these experiences to the player, a relentless series of them would just get tedious, all content is distance-based, not time-based, and no activities are started outside of the player's control. If the players are in the mood for more action, all they need to do is move forward, and within a few seconds, something will happen."
For God's sake, open the silo door! They're coming for us! It's our only way out! Oh my God, we're doomed!
And once you notice this, you start to see it in all of Valve's games. Half-Life 2 functions in much the same way. Ravenholm is basically a horror chapter, Water Hazard is a vehicle section on a hovercraft with brakes on foot to open doors to new areas, and Follow Freeman involves leading small bands of soldiers and firing rockets at striders.
Here, have a minute.
Even Portal 2 follows this, with sections involving goo, sections involving lasers, sections involving hard light bridges. And within each of those themed chapters, there's little bits of interest as rewards for progressing, from minor mechanical gags to hidden caches of items to storytelling and world-building content.
Hey, it's me! I'm okay!
Well, I'm back. The aerial faceplate in here is sending a distress signal. You broke it, didn't you?
The Valve formula, if there is such a thing from such a structureless company that barely makes games anymore, is to find a core mechanic or gameplay loop to hang the game on, then finding tertiary mechanics that can provide flavor or challenges to the core mechanic set, and playing with that twist for a few gameplay loop cycles. Then when they've exhausted that tertiary mechanic, they then use the transition between mechanic sets to forward the story a bit.
Dr. Freeman? Gordon Freeman? Is that you?
Why did the mechanics change? You return to City 17 a hero and everyone wants to help, so now there's squad mechanics.
Dr. Freeman? We're coming with you. With you here, Dr. Freeman, we can finally make some headway.
Or Wheatley took over Aperture Science and you fell into the old layers where the goo is. Half-Life 1 doesn't quite have that level of narrative thrust. It doesn't really have characters proper, and it barely has what one could call a plot. So most of the time here it's less story justifying mechanic changes than gameplay set pieces. Having to move quietly and use grenades to distract the tentacle monster in Blast Pit, or having to avoid constant gunfire from the Apache helicopter in Surface Tension. Still, you can see this idea in its infancy at different points in Half-Life. We've Got Hostiles does announce the arrival of Marines with laser tripwires and turrets that are notably military and not alien before you actually engage with any Marines. And Going to Zen is itself a story beat that also explains the change-up in mechanics. And I think this encapsulates why people found Half-Life storytelling so engaging. We had already seen first-person games with better stories by 1998. Marathon, for example, had closed out its trilogy 2 years ago at this point. But Marathon used regular drops of exposition-heavy text and pictures and the soliloquies of sarcastic AIs to convey its science fiction epic adventure where gods etched into silicon chips battled across multiple timelines with entire alien races as their pawns. Half-Life tried to keep players engaged in its world without heady exposition dumps, offering you only what Gordon Freeman could see as things fell apart. In essence, Half-Life did for sprawling sci-fi, horror, alien invasions what Cloverfield did for kaiju films. It was a boots-on-the-ground telling of War of the Worlds from one person's perspective, borrowing so heavily, and unabashedly, from The Mist, that its original name was Quiver in response to The Mist's Project Arrowhead. To be clear, Half-Life's story is not good. There's not really any characters or character arcs, and there's barely a structured rise in tension or coherent act structure. But the way these very basic beats, this shape of a sci-fi invasion story plays out, is very engaging because it happens around you as you move through the game space. I'm far from the first person to make this observation, but its design has a lot in common with theme park rides. It's not a narrative, it's a bunch of cool stuff that happens to and around you. The idea embraced by the Cabal that something interesting needs to happen every 50 feet or whatever necessarily means that bespoke, memorable events keep happening. And while that's not really what one could call a story, it is engaging.
Freeman, right? I've got a message for you. Make sure you don't...
So that explains the structure of the game, and I think maybe why it resonated so much more than many of its peers at the time of its release. But I don't think the game would have been received so warmly if its nuts and bolts weren't also really strong. And as a late 90s FPS game, it's pretty good. Its combat scales really well, with the early game's crowbar and pistol survival horror vibe slowly turning into a military shooter as you pick up shotguns and submachine guns as Marines are introduced, before becoming a full-on boomer shooter towards the end of the game with glue-on guns and Tau cannons offering sci-fi beams to counter gargantuan alien threats and snarks letting you drop literal aliens on people. And it transitions between those gameplay modes really seamlessly, sometimes multiple times per level. combat with the human Marines is a particular highlight. Even now, 25 years later, they're one of the more interesting enemies to fight in a first-person game. They will eagerly try to put cover between you and them. They will try to flank you. They will throw grenades to get you out in the open. And they telegraph all of it loudly enough that you can read it in the heat of battle. They announce that they're throwing grenades. They stop shooting when running for cover. It's tough to make good game enemy AI because you want something that feels smart and threatening but isn't designed to actually be all that smart or threatening. It's not hard to make an aimbot that auto-targets the player with a gun that does 999 damage instantly and call it a smart, tough AI. It's much harder to make a group of enemies feel like they're working together and feel like they're an intelligent threat, even as you take on rooms and rooms and rooms of them and are victorious every time. It's a magic trick about creating the belief the enemies are thinking more than actually making them think, and Half-Life pulls it off really, really well. Better than most games to this date, really. Another magic trick is the world of Black Mesa itself. It feels like a plausible, if fantastical and sci-fi space. There are offices for middle managers to congregate, complete with vending machines, retrofuturist science labs with wall-sized computers and linoleum floors, concrete storage facilities on the surface with electrical transformers just outside. And all of these scenes flow seamlessly into one another thanks to Half-Life's unbroken first-person perspective, where levels are interlinked and each loading section picks up exactly where the previous one left off. Minute to minute, its spaces feel organic and natural. It's only when you step back and think about them in aggregate that they kind of fall apart. It's not just that they make no sense design-wise, like, what is the point of this giant underground reservoir that is directly under an office complex? Why is the lab that tests the specimens for the Lambda complex on the other end of the facility from the Lambda complex? What exactly does this whole thing do? But it's also kind of all over the place. 1950s retrofuturist science labs jut up against modern office spaces, and all of that sits atop rusting industrial and sometimes even Quake-style Gothic architecture. Playing the game, I went from science labs to abandoned warehouses so often that I couldn't help but think of this riff from MST3K's Space Mutiny.
Good. Back to the rusting septic system of this futuristic spaceship.
But despite all of that, it works. It doesn't feel like a real space, but it feels like a believable space. A dreamscape that fuses rotting factories and Epcot's vision of science somewhere in the New Mexico desert. Black Mesa is an idea of a type of a place more than it's meant to be an actual location, and that abstraction works in the game's favor when shifting between gameplay styles and tones. It can be a spooky hallway, it can be a Call of Duty level, and it can be a super science lab with a simple transitional hallway or elevator. Which is really neat. Half-Life was incredibly successful from the moment it arrived to immense critical acclaim. The next year it would get an update that included Team Fortress, which is confusing because in all of the previews from the time it's called Team Fortress 2, since it was the sequel to the Quake mod Team Fortress. But then it released as simply Team Fortress, and then Valve got people hyped up in the early 2000s for a different Team Fortress 2 that never materialized. And nowadays, it's called Team Fortress Classic because the actually released Team Fortress 2 is sometimes just referred to as Team Fortress. And Team Fortress Classic is not to be confused with Team Fortress 2 Classic, the mod for Team Fortress 2 that tries to take Team Fortress back to its original roots. Everybody got that? Fun times. Half-Life also shipped with Worldcraft, the BSP editor they purchased and used as their level editor in development, so a modding scene developed early on. This scene eventually led to Counter-Strike, which was obviously a phenomenon in its own way. As you'll see in a bit, tactical games were popping off in the late 90s. Engaging with the mod community and up-and-coming developers was a thing with Valve. Many of the developers on Half-Life were picked up from the modding community, and even Portal originated as a student game. Quoting Mike Harrington from the final hours of Half-Life, "Both Gabe Newell and I didn't finish school. We dropped out to do software, and we firmly believe if you find a smart, creative person, they can do a great job. If you're lucky enough to find them early on, you can be around when they grow into themselves. That's the time when they do a lot of really interesting work." And it's fascinating to compare that late 90s quote from Valve with this quote from Ken Birdwell's LinkedIn profile some years later. Valve is the place to go as the culmination of a career. It's filled with 90% senior people who have run their own companies, not just projects or products. It's not uncommon to meet people who have been there only 10 years. So this new company, eager to nurture hungry young talent, would at some point after the advent of Steam become a place for super senior industry folks to get a residency and do whatever they like, but produce precious little that sees the light of day. It just feels a little sad, is all. Looking back from 2023, it's neat how you can see specific ideas or fixations that would develop and be refined already taking root in Half-Life. For example, the head crabs emerging from the sand in surface tension are an obvious precursor to antlions. Or how there's this BSP brush of tires that's the solution to a platforming puzzle. You push the tires onto the water because tires float. This was almost unintelligible at the time because physics engines simply didn't exist and floating objects weren't really a mechanic that had been introduced elsewhere in the game, but that sort of physics-based puzzle would become Half-Life 2's bread and butter. But even broadly, just the retro science fiction vibes. The decaying Venture Brothers compound, failed retro-futurist vision thing would show up again in Portal 2. And the otherworldly horror and government dystopia stuff would continue in Half-Life 2. In my first video on Half-Life over 10 years ago, I was a wee baby critic angry that the game was about doling out content rather than a game about systems. And I think there's still a valid criticism to be made there, maybe, about how Half-Life presaged games that would become content delivery vehicles that downplayed systems-based games and helped balloon budgets through the 2000s. And I think there's room for criticism of the Cabal approach, both in terms of its weird hypocrisy in a supposedly leaderless environment, but also the assumptions baked into its approach to games. Not all games can or should be linear experiences that benefit from having something interesting happening every 10 feet. There's something to be said for systems-driven games. There's something to be said for games that have quiet time or even boring bits. But these days, I've mellowed on Half-Life. Whatever my criticisms of the process, it clearly worked for this game. A quarter century on, Half-Life remains an engaging play from start to finish. And that is by design.
Quite a nasty piece of work you managed over there. I am impressed.
Elsewhere in 1998, it was, once again, a busy year. If there was one game that could have easily been the choice for 1998 instead of Half-Life, it was definitely Unreal. Both of these games catapulted their developers to tremendous levels of success, ultimately leading to each of them holding one of the two premier digital game storefronts on the PC. The Unreal Engine has also largely supplanted id Tech as the predominant third-party rendering engine used by games big and small. A lot of video game history starts with this title. But all of that's with the benefit of hindsight. In 1998, Unreal was seen mostly as a graphical wonder that pushed visual fidelity markedly forward in the way that games adopting ray tracing are seen as doing today. I still love this magazine cover from Next Generation. Yes, that's an actual PC game screenshot. And Epic leaned into this buzz with ads in magazines like this one. It's called Unreal because it is, with a massive 2-page spread. And yeah, the rendering tech absolutely felt like a glimpse into the future at the time. Most first-person games, including Half-Life, were still using offshoots of id Tech, or even Build, and while the Quake 1 and Quake 2 engines were perfectly capable of generating beautiful scenes, technology was still moving so fast that just a year after Quake 2's release, Unreal launched with a number of visual flourishes that it simply couldn't reproduce. For example, Unreal had the ability to render from multiple perspectives, allowing for things like reflections on the floor or impossible portals in the game space. It had volumetric fog that gave its worlds moody vibes, and believe it or not, at the time, killed your frame rate. And the game's artists created procedurally animated textures to make rippling water or fire sprites that move with an amazing fluidity and have this beautiful Winamp visualizer kind of feel to them. And it supported these massive, breathtakingly open vistas. Half-Life surface levels were neat, but they were mostly a small chunk of space surrounded by a skybox and some bounding geometry to hide the seams. Unreal took place in gorges and fields and temples and had villages just, as a little side area in them, and at a level of fidelity that other games at the time couldn't approach. It looks kind of quaint now, Small indie teams can and have done work that looks like this on conservative budgets with modern tools, but at the time it felt bleeding edge, and I don't know how to impress upon people that are younger than like 20 how impressive this was. As for the game itself, you're the one surviving inmate of a prison ship that crash landed on a planet full of evil aliens and has to shoot their way out, tropey even by 1998 first-person shooter standards. But you're not just on a planet of evil aliens, you're on what turns out to be a slave colony. Some time ago, aliens named Scarge arrived on the planet Nepali from outer space and enslaved the native population of peaceful, four-armed aliens named the Nali, and turned the planet into a mining colony for a rare crystal called Teridium. As you try to escape the planet, you'll have the opportunity to help Nali, who can help you in turn. In the end, you might not only escape Nepali, but overthrow the Scarge's entire evil operation on the planet. It's seeped in an Avatar-style, metaphorical, white savior trope, where the human comes to save the helpless Nali from their oppressors. But if you can look past that, and that's asking a fair bit, the game really works. Unreal is eminently playable in a way a lot of other games in this list just aren't. Each weapon has a unique and considered utility to the player, and combat is built around a defense game of circle strafing and dodging enemy fire, so much so that they added a dodge action that you can take by double tapping a directional input. Unfortunately, this often leads to diving off cliffs about as often as it leads to jumping out of the way of fire. But it shows the devs were actively thinking about how you engage with their combat systems. And speaking of combat, much like Half-Life, Unreal has a particularly intelligent and engaging enemy to fight. There are lots of monsters that come at you. Rocket launcher-holding brutes, floating needle-flinging tentacles, aquatic acid-spitting sliths, and enormous titans that throw boulders at you. But it's the humanoid Scarge themselves that are a joy to engage. Where Half-Life soldiers seek cover for themselves and try to flush you out of yours, Scarge feel as nimble and aggressive as you do. They'll circle strafe around your projectiles, dive forward for melee strikes, and even do the same dodge to the side that you can do. They're not quite this intelligent or dangerous, but if you'll allow me the comparison, they do kind of feel a bit like a rough early version of one of those parts of a FromSoft game where you're fake invaded by another player. It's got that same, oh, there's regular dummy enemies I can just mindlessly take out, and then there's these guys energy. I also absolutely have to shout out the score by Alexander Brandon, Andrew Sega, and Michiel Vandenbos. The Unreal Engine used synthesizer tracker music, and it is just my absolute favorite era of game soundtracks. This, Unreal Tournament, Deus Ex, all of it. When you're in a Nali temple or village, the cold synth techno beats provide a sterile contrast to the humid, mossy, overgrown environments, as out of place as the Scarge or you. Plus, they just absolutely slap. This is Monday morning quarterbacking, but I think what ultimately caused Unreal to live in Half-Life's shadow was that it was so graphically intensive. It simply didn't run well on your average machine at the time. Because playing it now, it does a lot of what Half-Life did. And it did it prettier and 6 months sooner. An unbroken single-player story, a smart and nimble enemy type that's particularly more fun to fight than the others, and solidly designed gameplay. The only thing it's really lacking is Half-Life's pacing, that constant Valve-style switch from set-piece to set-piece and gameplay gimmick to gameplay gimmick. Unreal is, instead, just a bunch of first-person shooter levels in a sequence. But it's still easily one of the best games I've looked at so far for this series, and the vibes and music are immaculate. It's just a shame that Epic have decided to more or less abandon their own history. In what is perhaps the ultimate irony, all of this footage was captured from a copy sold to me on Valve's Steam, because Epic doesn't offer their own classic titles on their storefront. Moreover, Epic have since unlisted Unreal from Steam and other platforms. And a lot of games in the show are generally unavailable now, but they're usually long-dead IPs or games from defunct companies. Epic is very much still around, still owns the rights, still puts out the engine that bears this game's name, and has more money than God. They just don't want to bother to preserve their past as a small-time 90s video game maker as they maneuver to being a big-time tech company styling themselves as the vanguards of the metaverse. There's a bleak cynicism in that decision, I think, that treats their own storied and worthwhile history as a series of disposable steps to the next billion-dollar franchise. And I think as a show interested in cataloging a history of games, it's important to call that out. Sin is sort of the distant third of the big tentpole first-person shooters of 1998. It was developed by Ritual Entertainment, a game development studio in Dallas founded, in part, by ex-3D Realms employees, and they took much of that house style with them. Like Duke Nukem 3D before it, Sin is a game deeply infused with an action movie sensibility. 10 years after the police have been abolished and replaced by private enforcers, you play as John Blade, a private security badass and the head of Hardcore. Yes, hardcore, it's that kind of game. Blade sits among Judge Dredd and RoboCop as manifestations of brutal judge, jury, and executioner style policing.
Why shouldn't I ventilate you?
Hey, if you let me live, I'll give you some important information.
But the game never really interrogates the whole police privatization thing. It's mostly an excuse to do away with due process in favor of rad action sequences, which was tropey genre writing in 1998, and in 2023 borders on deeply uncomfortable.
Nope.
Blade, there's the factory foreman. Make sure this is final shipment. You know what I mean?
Regardless, you're hired to foil a bank heist, which Blade discovers was ordered by local mob boss Mancini. You chase Mancini through the city for several levels, but when you find him, he's turned into a giant mutant monster. It turns out that Mancini and his mob only did the job at the behest of Alexis Sinclair, the billionaire head of Syntech. She obviously didn't need the money, she just wanted a MacGuffin in one of the bank's safety deposit boxes to fulfill her evil dreams of turning everyone in the city into mutants through the water supply.
Well, while we were busy taking care of this waterworks scare, Syntech was busy stealing nuclear warheads from a military base.
What?
Or maybe nuking everyone in the world so they can be replaced by her genetically engineered monsters. It doesn't matter. None of this matters. It's a bunch of excuses to string B-action movie and video game tropes together, from boss fights to construction site shootouts to turret sections to underwater secret bases to stealth bits to science labs full of plot. Those set pieces aren't quite paced as well as Half-Life, and it doesn't have combat quite as enjoyable as Unreal, but it's all eminently passable. There are games in this list that are painful to play, and we'll get to them, but Sin isn't. It's just not exciting. The core combat is really basic. Enemies all but stand still as they shoot at you, in stark contrast to Half-Life and Unreal's more mobile enemies. And the set pieces do manage to break up the monotony of the gameplay, but they're both one-note and overlong.
Full speed ahead.
Like, Half-Life set pieces manage to riff on the already engaging core combat. On a Rail asks, can you do our combat system while riding a train? Sin puts its combat aside for janky stealth.
Hey, did you hear something?
Or underwater segments where you move really slowly and need to use a dart gun. Or annoying keycard hunts that all last too long before returning to its cromulent but unexciting core shooting mechanics. None of it is terrible, but none of it is all that good either. In the tradition of 3D Realms games, it revels in interactions for interaction's sake. The opening level, for example, features a turret sequence with a minigun as you approach the big bank robbery. There's a billboard you can shoot, and if you do, it'll crash through the skylight of the bank below. Then when you finally enter the bank, the billboard will or will not be there based on your choices. And if not, you could always just crash it yourself from within the bank.
Man, we cannot afford that.
And while walking around the bank, you can find the pin of Alexis Sinclair, the game's antagonist. If you use that pin on the ATM, you can pull all of her money out and put it in your account because, well, it's kind of funny. It's a cute ludic gag, and it shows off the game's cool in-engine computer terminals. Meanwhile, the game's weapons continue to be able to destroy the usual list of desks and chairs and file cabinets. Enemies can be shot in individual body parts that can then switch to a damage texture, which often leads to you engaged in an active shootout with men with gunshot wounds to their foreheads.
Rock and roll!
It is also that kind of game. And speaking of it being that kind of game in general, people get mad whenever I criticize a video game for sexism because gamers are terrible, but also, I get it. These games are all 25 years old. There's problematic stuff in every one of them, and if I talked about it every time, we'd be here forever. But even by 1998 standards, Sin's portrayal of Alexis Sinclair was a little much.
I'm extremely pleased by your devotion to the cause. You may join me in my chambers at 11:30 this evening. Don't be late.
Yes, ma'am.
It feels like the devs are maybe working some stuff out here.
I love obedient men.
There's surely a way to do a campy, fun, sexy villain, but this isn't a fun sexy. It's more, "Hey Ralph, check out the tits on that broad."
Now pay attention, because I have something very special to show you.
Save it for someone who cares, wench.
But John, I'm willing to bet my life you've never seen anything like this before. Watch.
I don't...
This!
Oh, hell.
It is very, very much that kind of a game. Sin would go on to spawn an expansion pack in 1999 and an anime movie in 2000. It also has an episodic title that only managed to get one episode made in 2006, which maybe we'll get there someday? In 2020, Night Dive announced plans to do a kinda sorta HD remaster, but I don't think we've heard much movement on that since, and who knows what the status is. 2020 was a weird year. Most recently, John Blade has shown up at the end of the trailer for the upcoming Phantom Fury, the follow-up to the Build Retro title Ion Fury.
You think that arm makes you look cool or something?
So the property's still kicking around somewhere in the hearts of the people at 3D Realms and associated companies, and maybe we'll get to see Blade doing his fashy 80s cop thing again sometime. But Sin itself as a game is irrevocably of its time, with big 90s gamer energy. It suffers from being an action movie pastiche that doesn't feel as cartoonishly exaggerated or fun or funny as Duke Nukem 3D, and it suffers from being a first-person shooter that never really managed to find the fun in any of its core mechanics. And because of that, it doesn't leave much of an impression. Half-Life and Unreal had vibes, specific emotional spaces they would evoke with their worlds and stories and gameplay. Sin takes a series of 80s action movie tropes, 90s FPS ideas, and an over-sexualized villainess, strings them together with some one-liners and gags, and thinks it is the coolest person in the world for doing that totally earnestly. And in the moment, in 1998, it passed as kinda cool. Now, it kind of reads as embarrassing.
Ask Hadwin and Mueller to check out his ovaries.
Mueller, Hadwin, check his ovaries. What?
Sir, you say something?
Oh.
I'm kicking your ass later, JC. You do realize that, right?
Oh, man. Ovaries. I got that on audio, too.
I'm not going to spend too much time on Thief, mostly because I have a video on it that still, for the most part, holds up. I will say, though, playing this in context next to its peers, it really was just an astonishing breath of fresh air. Thief is slow and methodical in an era where other games were eager to be faster and tighter. Even more than the Scourge in Unreal and the soldiers in Half-Life, encounters with individual enemies here are complex and multifaceted affairs. Players need to actually think about how they're going to deal with a guard in the next room. Whether it was knocking them out by sneaking quietly up behind them on the carpet, waiting for their patrol to take them out of the room and simply avoiding them, or using an arrow to solve the problem remotely. Its immersive sim roots really show. Choices about how to infiltrate a space, what gameplay style to adopt, how to gear up for a mission, and more all inform your solutions to problems. That's not to say it's flawless. It's kind of ugly, even for its time. I stand by my complaints about its overall story pacing and the size of some of its levels being simply too large. And its controls remain awkward and janky enough to put off most newcomers. It takes a mission or two to start jiving with its floaty movement, and the way its version of WASD is WZXC, with the A and D keys turning players and the Q and E keys leaning left and right. When you're trying to open a lock, you need to pick the individual key for that lock in your inventory in order to use it, which many modern players may feel is a quality of life issue, but I feel is an intentional design decision to leave you fumbling with your keyring as a guard approaches. There are a million small decisions like that, things that would be smoothed over in a modern game that give the game both its jank and its identity. In aggregate, they feel like a serious hurdle for younger players, but one I sincerely think is worth overcoming for the richness of the experience it provides. It is some of the best entry-level jank to get you accommodated to games that push back against players a little bit, that bristle at the idea of being too pliable to your demands. But if you can get past it, there's a game full of close calls, memorable escapes, and the sense that you were able to hoodwink guards who are dangerous enough to make that feel thrilling. Thief is also probably the one game on this list I feel comfortable not calling a shooter, which gives you an idea of where first-person games were generally in 1998. And it's certainly the most cohesive in its storytelling out of all the games we talk about today, with cutscenes, level locations, incidental barks, art design, and more, all contributing to its fantasy steampunk world, where forces of anarchic forest chaos magic and authoritarian mechanical order wage an invisible war for power witnessed only by watchers that record it all. It's smart and rewarding and different, and if you can get into it, it's still easy to see why I fell in love with it a quarter century ago. Just maybe rebind the keys.
This must be how they spend all those tithes.
In its heyday, Sierra and Dynamics' Tribes was multiplayer FPS maximalism. Half-Life and Quake and Unreal may have had action-packed deathmatches, but Tribes had full-scale warfare. In its most popular gameplay mode, Capture the Flag, 2 teams of 16 players, a huge number at the time, by the way, would face off, each with their own base of operations. Players all came equipped with jetpacks, providing increased mobility and enabling a level of verticality to the otherwise expansive landscapes. Maps were so large that scout vehicles and troop transports could be summoned to help players traverse them. The game had a create-your-own-class system by letting players choose from heavy, medium, and light armor and equipping themselves with different weapons and items. You could grab heavy armor and a mortar and rain fire down from above, take medium armor and use the classic spin fuser or chain gun to attack other infantry, or you could be a lean and mean sniper by picking light armor and an energy pack. Each team's base could have its turrets, sensors, and inventory purchasing tools destroyed, and you could shut the entire base down if you managed to blow up their generator deep in the base's core, turning off everything. Or you could also be playing defense, protecting your flag, or repairing your base if they managed to shut down your generator or blow up your inventory machines, or even just placing sensors that would give you a heads up that enemies were coming. So play wasn't just about shooting the other guy first, it was about figuring out how to use your different classes together, sniping or mortaring the defensive players at the enemy base, having some players sneak in and take out the generator and doing as much damage as they can along the way, and all the while light armored folks could be making a run for the flag. In a world before Battlefield 1942, where Team Fortress was still just a Quake 1 mod, this was the apex of class-based, team-based, objective-based multiplayer games that asked for players to strategize as much as it asked for players to circle strafe. One of the things I keep trying to do on this show is talk about the games as they were and as they are now. And as it was, Tribes was hugely influential, with a vibrant community and level of complexity to its play you didn't get in other titles. I had a ton of fun with it in its day. But now, the servers sit idle. The only way I could capture footage was joining a server running a bunch of bots to fill empty player slots, and it's just not the same. The other games in this video I was more or less able to revisit, but this felt like stopping by the parking lot where the Pizza Hut you had your 10th birthday at once stood. If you squint, you can kind of see where the foundation was and even picture where your parents' old car would have parked. And it's nostalgic and you have fond memories of that place, but also, it's gone and you can't go back. And then you realize you're not sure whether Pizza Hut has even had dine-in service in like a decade, and then you feel really old. To wit, the Tribes brand seems largely forgotten. It's been over a decade since Tribes Ascend, itself a multiplayer-only first-person game that has seen its servers taken offline. You can't play this one either. Tribes' ideas are no longer cutting-edge game design, but commonplace. Team Fortress 2's class-based play, Battlefield's large maps with vehicles, Titanfall's mobility mechanics that enable verticality and agility, all of these are built on top of concepts Tribes pioneered in some small way, but rob Tribes of a compelling identity all of its own here in 2023. In a sense, time has moved on from Star Siege Tribes twice. Once when its audience left its servers empty, but also when the game's cultural moment had passed. I don't think we need a Tribes now, here in 2023. I don't know what value it would provide. We have other games. But for those too young to remember, we definitely needed it then. Jurassic Park Trespasser is a personal favorite of mine, even if it is kind of a train wreck. It wanted to be a rules-driven, emergent sim-adjacent survival horror game, which is exactly what you'd expect for a project led by former Looking Glass employee and future Xbox designer Seamus Blackley. It is, however, a game whose ambitions far outpaced both its budget and the technology available at the time. For example, just about any moderately sized object was a proper physics object, from barrels to rocks to weapons to boxes to plywood, and you could manipulate any and all of them by sticking out your hand, grabbing on them, and dragging them around. This was years before any physics middleware was common. Havoc and physics didn't come around until after the millennium. But here in 1998, we have a game doing box stacking and seesaw puzzles. It looks goofy, and it sounds sarcastic of me to say this, but it genuinely was ahead of its time. No other game could do this. Remember, Half-Life 1 had the weird hacky box tires as its sole physics-ish puzzle. And like Half-Life, it never really wanted to break from first person, but it took that to an even greater extreme by having no heads-up display, which sounds immersive until you realize players needed to know things like how much ammo and health they have. And they famously solved this issue by having the health be a tattoo on Anne's body on her left breast. The more the tattoo was colored, the more damage she'd taken. So it's a game where you spend a lot of time just looking at your own boobs. As for ammo, well...
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's it. Feels full.
Guns are all single-use and can't be reloaded, so they simply had Anne rattle off the number of bullets left in the chamber before you could just chuck the gun at a raptor.
4. Empty. Looks like 20.
So you can see how it's a mess, but it's like an endearing mess. The game also really wanted to capture the majesty and autonomy of dinosaurs, rather than having them be generic video game monsters. What was attempted was to give the dinosaurs bespoke bodies. Dinosaurs of the same species would be different sizes or colors, and each was meant to be its own animal. And those animals would drive their body parts individually. They would turn their head to track you or bite at you, they would move their legs individually to walk forward, that sort of thing. It wasn't a canned animation, the AI was driving them like puppets. It's the feature that gave rise to this, perhaps one of the game's most compelling promotional images. A T-Rex sticking its head through a door of a cabin that Anne is hiding in, trying to get at her despite not being able to fit. But while the idea is really cool, and I'd love to see more modern games try it, the reality of its implementation was less impressive. Slack-jawed theropods would charge at you only to trip over their own feet or tiptoe to turn around. Sauropods who had no use for moving their head because they weren't trying to bite you or look at you would walk via tippy-toe steps with their necks locked upright. None of it looked good or real, even if the idea was to make it more simulational. And all of this, the impressively expansive outdoor-indoor environments, the AI running the physical dinosaur bodies, the physics engine itself...
They guys watched it on the ultrasound monitor. Looked like a ghost or a puff of smoke.
And all of that tech was largely CPU bound, which meant that computers of the time really struggled to run the game. And it's clear the developers had to make concessions to their original vision for the project to make it even kind of playable on then modern hardware. Like, the game was previewed looking something like this, with lush forests and amazing shadows. And what people actually played looked more like this.
Almost out. Feels full.
There was one genuinely great thing about Trespasser, though. The game takes place after The Lost World, where John Hammond has, in the wake of various legal battles and bankruptcies, released a memoir about his time with InGen. In-game, Hammond's memoirs are served up out of order as Anne remembers the relevant bits, introductions for various dinosaurs, explanations for certain buildings, that sort of thing.
Curving up out to the southern basin, the Atherton Causeway would bring visiting scientists north from the southern beach.
But fans created a supercut of all the memoir bits in order with clearer audio recordings and some minor audiobook flourishes, and it is a really, really, really good companion piece for Jurassic Park, both the film and the novels.
My name is John Parker Hammond. I was born on March 14th, 1928. What follows is a record of certain events in which I took part between the years 1980 and 1997, on an island I will call Site B.
If you're the sort of nerd that got really into this property like I did, it's extremely enjoyable. Hearing Sir Richard Attenborough deliver Hammond's lines looking back wistfully at his life's work, documenting the day-to-day of trying to run a state-of-the-arts genetic lab and a zoo on a tropical island is just... It's great stuff. What's most shocking playing Trespasser now is that there are moments where you see what it was meant to be. Raptors actually track you with their eyes, staring up at you when you're on a cliff and trying to figure out how to get to you, or glancing at you from across the plains to size you up as prey. Tyrannosaurs actually have to get you in their jaws to do damage, so it's not uncommon to dive out of the way of tooth and claw as a 7-ton animal brushes by. And that's genuinely exciting. And the clunky, physics-based movement and aiming worked to the game's advantage as a survival horror title. There's something genuinely terrifying about your only offense being a gun you can't really aim, and your only defense being a body that doesn't quite move the way you want it to.
About half the way. Almost gone.
There are flashes of a really good survival horror game here with procedural AI, and it's just exactly the game they advertised, and it's all buried behind 65 million years of jank and compromise. Don't misunderstand me, it isn't good. I'm not recommending you go play this, but there are times where you can see the ideas that underlie it, and they are good, that someone taking a crack at this idea now might have a real gem on their hands. To quote John Hammond himself,
"The technology, the real trick of it, is still in there. In a darkened room, in an empty building with a dirty floor, it waits. The flashpoint, the origin of Jurassic Park. Creation is an act of sheer will. And next time, it'll be flawless."
Empty.
In October, Microprose released Klingon Honor Guard. And as a first-person shooter unto itself, I wouldn't particularly recommend it. It's the second game ever released using the Unreal Engine, and one gets the sense that Microprose were kind of letting Epic take the lead on development. Honestly, it feels like a fan mod for Unreal. A lot of the enemies are more or less reused. I do love how the Klingons take the Scourge dive and turn it into the Captain Kirk roll, though. But the weapons feel flaccid, the level design has virtually no flow or direction through a lot of samey corridors or caverns, and frankly it's kind of ugly. It's also ridiculously hard to get running on modern systems, with cutscenes that run in an antiquated codec, fan patches to fix the music by replacing the game's default maps with versions that load music from UMX ports of the soundtrack, and lots of sketchy DLL replacements required just to get it up and running. And I don't know if it was all that patching or if the game was always like this, but the protagonists just can't stop panting like they're out of breath. It is incredibly irritating. That said, despite being a mediocre and broadly forgotten shooter, I find the game kind of fascinating as an artifact. By 1998, the next generation had been over for 4 years. Deep Space Nine was airing its last season, and we were halfway through Voyager. But instead of doing the easy thing and being about any of those shows, as later Star Trek shooters would do, the game centers on political intrigue deep in the heart of the Klingon Empire with nary a Starfleet uniform or Galaxy-class starship in sight. There was a conspiracy to kill Chancellor Gowron by someone high up in the Klingon honor guard, and while he barely survived, it's up to you as a brand new, and therefore presumably uncorrupted, honor guard initiate to get to the heart of the matter. And it's just such an obsessive, nerdy take on the property.
Perhaps Gowron will let you serve him again soon, when you meet in Stovo Core.
You can throw dock togs.
Nursemaid should fight.
Your character uses Ferengi as an insult.
Little Ferengi.
The super health item is eating gawk. Tony Todd returns as Kern.
At Gowron's request, I am to serve as your instructor as you train for your induction.
And all of this is nerd minutia that even 90% of the people who watch Star Trek don't care about. This is a game for hardcore Star Trek nerds by hardcore Star Trek nerds. The entire stakes of the narrative are your honor and the need to defend the Klingon Empire, and the game 100% assumes you're bringing that to the table because it's not going to sell you on it, it's just going to tell you what's up and assume you know what's going on.
In the meantime, I will personally investigate the message received by the prison warden. It seems not everyone wants our mission to succeed.
And I know I said this about Star Wars last time, but Star Trek just can't get this weird with it anymore. This was when game budgets were low enough that a major first-person shooter could release and feel, well, like an Unreal mod, and when Star Trek was just Wednesday night UPN programming. Now Star Trek is one of the pillars propping up Viacom's streaming strategy, and video game shooter budgets are dozens of millions of dollars. If a game is made today, it's going to be about the adventures of an Enterprise ship, not exploring the fringes of the Star Trek universe's other races, beings, and empires. And for that reason, I think the game is really memorable and also kind of adorable. It's a game for dorks by dorks, and I'm enough of a dork to appreciate that.
Today was a good day for you to die.
Then, hot on the heels of 1997's Blood, Monolith released not one, but two first-person shooters in 1998. The first was Shogo, Mobile Armor Division, which is notable for being a fairly early example of an American game taking direct inspiration from anime. In this case, it's drawing heavily from Gundam and other mech anime. Play oscillates between levels where you're in a giant mech suit and levels where you're on foot, with each mode having its own weapons and enemies. That sounds really cool, but it never quite works the way you'd want it to. When you're in the mech, nothing ever feels appropriately weighty or powerful. Unlike Titanfall, which deals with a similar concept, it never feels like you're going from a lithe and nimble little guy to a giant armored mecha. But it plays with size in a fun way, and it's neat to see the world rendered in 1998-era low-poly blockiness, but at a scale that renders entire city blocks rather than individual rooms. And at least when you're doing the mech stuff, you're typically dealing with rockets and plasma bursts and other weapons that can be dodged. When you're on foot, you're fighting seas of enemies with hair triggers, instant lock-on aim, and hit-scan weapons.
They got the lobby secure, so you better head for the service tunnel access over by the interference array. It'll be a hell of a lot safer.
And even if you survive the sudden and unavoidable damage, healing is a problem. While health items exist, most healing is done by random critical hits that flash a purple light and deliver 25 health back to you. But that means the game's primary healing mechanic is based on engaging enemies who deal ridiculous damage on sight with attacks you can't dodge. This results in wildly fluctuating difficulty between constant instant death and a shooting gallery. It is not a fun play experience. Played now, there's just a pervasive sense that this could be realized so much better if it had just come out a few years later, once cell shading was a thing, and drawing in an anime style was more common in the States. American artists hadn't quite mastered it yet. As is, its attempt to replicate anime style mostly comes across as kind of ugly and basic, with blobs of flat color that don't feel stylized like cell shading, they just feel blurry and unfinished.
I have my orders, sir. Please be nice to me.
The game also suffers from large empty corridors that make no sense to be designed for mechs, and shooting mechanics that are passably boring when you're in your mech and frustrating and janky when you're on foot. Like Klingon Honor Guard, it's more notable for what it represents. Anime was just taking over nerd culture, but it hadn't quite reached critical mass yet. The theme song's catchy, though. Later in the year, Monolith also released Blood 2, the sequel to 1997's Blood. It's a fairly radical rework given the time frame. In a little over a year and a half, the franchise made the jump to full 3D via the Lithtech engine from the 2.5D build engine, and it also jumped a century forward in time. Where Blood was set somewhere in the early 20th century, Blood 2 takes place 100 years later in the far-flung cyberpunk future of 2028. The Cabal have spent that time regrouping from their defeat, growing from an extremist religious sect to the huge techno-industrial behemoth known as Cabalco, which is about the level of humor to expect here. Like Blood, Blood 2 fashions itself as a horror comedy, but it's cranked up to kind of an obnoxious level here. I don't want to oversell the original Blood, but part of what made it work was that it was like 80% a horror action game played straight, with these little nuggets of comedy from Caleb or tucked away in Easter eggs or environmental art. Here the comedy is front and center, and it does not bear the weight the game is putting on it.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, Mr. Talib. I'm with a market research firm, and we're doing a survey on computer games. This call is not an attempt to sell you anything. First question, are you currently or have you ever been a character in a computer game?
You've gotta be kidding.
It's the sort of thing where with a little bit more tuning, you can see how Monolith would later give us a comedic gem like No One Lives Forever, and if it were a little bit more laid back and less try-hard, you'd get a horror game that's quietly humorous like the original Blood. As is, it's too cute by half, and it feels like no one told the game's writers no or to workshop their material to get it good enough to be included.
Another day, another another reason for me. Ooh, this could be bad.
The real problem, as with Shogo, is the combat design. Again, there's an emphasis on high-damage hit-scan weapons wielded by enemies that open fire as soon as they see you. Also, I can't confirm any of this from any official source, but the general consensus among fans, and noted FPS YouTuber Civi, is that damage dealt and received is randomized, similar to crits in Shogo, leading to difficulty spikes and nadirs for no reason.
Teacher. Make the hurting stop. Who wants some, huh? Who's next?
Meanwhile, you don't even have the health regen on crits that Shogo has, just health pickups that are still bizarrely scarce, leading to a game where you more or less insta-die at random with very little recourse or defense.
Make the hurting stop. Oh, you son of a bitch!
So the only way to play the action horror comedy game that should be tons of bloody fun vaporizing cultists is just save scumming while cheesing enemies or picking them off before they can hurt you through rote memorization of their locations. It is mostly just pain, and when combined with the 1990s nerd comedy and references, I just wouldn't recommend it. That said, I still do adore the Lithtech blood particle effects. There's something just juicy about them. 1998 was also the last dying gasp of the build engine. which was really forward-looking in 1995, came into its own in 1996 and 1997, but by 1998 was looking pretty long in the tooth next to Unreal and Half-Life. Its use was mostly relegated to budget releases like Xtreme Paintbrawl, an attempt to make a more kid-friendly multiplayer shooter game by replacing the guns that shoot bullets with the guns that shoot paintballs. I don't have much to say here. I never played it at the time, and I could never get it to run for this video, but its reputation as a legendarily bad title with obnoxious music is pretty well known. Then there was Nam, which was even more obviously a Duke Nukem 3D mod than Klingon Honor Guard was an Unreal mod, even down to using John St. John's grunt. Nam is a weird title that feels like it's trying to do two things at once. On one hand, it's a Vietnam movie pastiche, whose plot involves its genetically engineered badass protagonist being dropped behind enemy lines in 1966 to do covert CIA violence, cracking one-liners while a MIDI sound-alike of Paint It Black plays. It's all of the badass parts of Rambo and Platoon and Full Metal Jacket without any of the criticism of the war itself. But Nam also sought design advice from one Sergeant Dan Snyder, a Marine who worked on a US military-produced mod of Doom used to train troops called Marine Doom. And that seems to have resulted in a game where pretty much everything that could kill you in the Vietnam conflict will kill you in Nam. Mortar fire rains down and you'll never know if it was called from friendly or enemy sources. Chemical and explosive mines lie hidden in tall grass, as do enemies that will shoot you unseen. Crates that may contain ammo are sometimes booby-trapped.
Damn it to heck!
Jumping next to your helicopter kills you. There's bleeding mechanics that can kill you if you can't find bandages. As a play experience for, video game fun time, it's agony, and I can see why it was kind of reviled at launch. It was actually nominated for Worst Game of the Year in 1998 by GameSpot, but lost to Trespasser if you want a sense of the vibe of the time. But if you look at it as less of an ooh-rah military game and more like an avant-garde title experimenting with hyper-lethal gameplay mechanics to convey something about the arbitrary nature of who lives in war, about the futility of trying to be a hero, and the absurdity of the fantasy of the hero with the gun, it kind of rules. My gut instinct is that if it were released today as an itch.io title, it'd do really well. Mario Maker Kaizo levels, Getting Over It clones, and Dark Souls are some of the most popular material around. People love bullshit hard games. That's not really what this is, not least of all because you can save scum through it, so it's not like those other titles where each loss is felt. But that's the vibe it gives in 2023. In 1998, it was an ugly, frustrating, budget Duke Nukem 3D mod, but today it kind of feels like someone just dropped the hottest art house boomer shooter of the season. A game designed to frustrate players, but that's the whole point. And that's kind of rad for a weird budget game in 1998. Finally, Nam wasn't the only military-influenced shooter released in 1998. Tactical action games were having something of a moment. This is, after all, the year that Metal Gear Solid got released. There was Delta Force, a title by Novalogic, makers of other military sims like F-22 Raptor and Comanche. Delta Force is a game with wide-open voxel environments where you would lead assaults on various bases, encampments, and fortifications to retrieve an item, blow up some specific hardware, or eliminate targets. Whatever. Really, the sniping is what sells the game. Being able to peek down the scope and engage with enemies half a mile away is undeniably pretty charming, especially since there aren't any ballistics or recoil to speak of. It's arcadey and quaint, and these nice big open environments aren't really something you saw a lot of in 1998. Otherwise, it's a lot of sneaking around deserts and tundras, picking off soldiers, or trying to sneak into bases. It's fine, but it's also kind of forgettable. But the real tactical titan for the year was Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six. Delta Force had its missions all planned out for you. It was your job to memorize what to do at each waypoint and then execute that plan like a good soldier. But Rainbow Six asked you to come up with the plan. You could assign team members with different stats and skills to different teams, plot out their intended paths through a level, set up what they should be doing at each waypoint, and assign checkpoints where they would wait until you give the call sign to proceed, enabling you to control the flow of action. Then, once you were satisfied with your plan, you would execute it, pop into the game world, and lead each team along the way. You could switch between teams at any time, so if there was a particularly difficult or complex task that you didn't trust the AI to do, you could take over. But as soon as you weren't in control, the AI would resume executing the plan until it reached a checkpoint that required a call sign to proceed. So you had to plan for when you intended to shift control, if that makes any sense.
In position. Alpha, go!
Where Delta Force focused on scoping enemies with laser beam guns from over a mile away, Rainbow Six was more interested in your tactical movement than your aiming skills. Every time you changed velocity by tapping a different movement key, and every time you adjusted your aim, your precision indicator went super wide. So trying to aim by moving your mouse actually made you briefly less accurate. Instead, the game leaned on an auto-aim mode that moved the cursor to an enemy if they were in your sights. The result is a game that pushes you to not fling the mouse around to immediately target an enemy and shoot them like most games, but one that encourages cool, smooth movement. Angle yourself in the doorway and smoothly walk across. If an enemy is there, they'll get targeted. It forced an intentionality to your movement and positioning that really felt like you had to plan and then commit to it. Looking around gets you shot. Smoothly, cautiously checking corners keeps you alive. The result is a tense game where panicking and small mistakes could cost you dearly very quickly, especially since operatives who died in your campaign stayed dead. You could do a whole other hour-and-a-half-long video essay unpacking Tom Clancy's conservative politics and how they impacted the games that bore his name, as well as the part that video games play in the military-industrial complex more broadly. God help us when we get to 2002 and I have to cover America's Army. But I do kind of miss military games being able to be stuff like this. Truly tactical games that encourage thoughtful planning in contrast to the action movie bravado that pervaded so much of the genre. Alas, that's no longer the case. I once said at some point, Star Wars games stopped being based on Star Wars and instead became video games about Star Wars, and the same thing seems to have happened to Tom Clancy's brand of real-world tactical action. The latest Rainbow Six game is a co-op PvE game in the vein of Left 4 Dead about shooting aliens. No one wants a game where you stare at a map for half of your playtime, and I get it. But something of value there was lost, and I kind of lament that. So where does 1998 leave us? Well, it's a year where the obnoxious little gremlin guy sort of came into its own as an enemy. This was a thing in 90s shooters that has mostly died out today, where designers would add a small enemy that's hard to aim at and hit, and is mostly just there to annoy you. You know, the people in Shogo when you're in the mecha, the spiders in Unreal, the headcrabs and snarks in Half-Life, the wormy things and the hands in Blood 2, the spiders in Thief, that sort of thing. It's also a year where we really feel how fast the technology is growing. The first Unreal Engine game released in the same year as multiple Build Engine games. To give you a sense of how fast graphics technology was changing, 5 years before now, in 2018, Battlefield 5 came out and was cutting-edge technology, and it still looks pretty good. 5 years before Unreal, in 1993, Doom came out and was cutting-edge technology. And by 1998, you could tell. It was also a year where the first-person boom started to go bust. Other than Half-Life and Unreal, almost none of these games made all that much money. Shogo and Tribes were supposed to get expansions that didn't happen because of mediocre sales. Trespasser famously flopped. Blood 2 and Sin didn't do all that well. One of the few other bright spots was Thief, which over its life sold at least 500,000 copies, which had to have been a boon for its developer. What did they do with that success? Maybe we'll take a look. Look
at you, hacker. A pathetic creature of meat and bone, panting and sweating as you run through my corridors. How can you challenge a perfect, immortal machine?